Hello and welcome to the React on Rails tutorial series. This first video is going to cover using the Doorkeeper app that we built in a previous tutorial, which I'll have a link to in the video description. That's going to be our backend Rails app. It's then going to have a front-end React app that you can use to interact with the Rails app as if it was just a regular API. The Rails app itself has restricted links. I can't access this one without logging in. Both of these are API only. And if I sign into a test account, test@case.com, the password of password, if I click on the webhooks, it won't take me anywhere because that's actually an admin only link. So if I log into an admin account, which I think is admin@example.com, I'll then be able to look at the webbooks section where I have a whole list of books that I can create and say, I don't know, another one. I'll leave it as a typo. You can click create book. All of this works just like a regular Rails app. But of course, this is the Rails section of the application that allows you to browse the books. The actual React app is over here. I can log into the same account. And you can see here that when you log into the account, hopefully you can see here that we have the user ID being printed out to the screen, the email, the user's role. So they're either a regular user like test@case.com or they're an admin. You also have the created at being sent. You have an access token. This is not being stored. This is simply kept in memory because you don't expire this. So it's a little bit dangerous to just leave this out in the wild. You also have a refresh token. This one is stored locally, which is normally a security risk, except this is a revolving refresh token, which means that it will expire after a set period of time. And every time you access it, you can see here, you get a new access token and a new refresh token. And those are stored in your, well, I guess the refresh token is stored in your local storage. So let me come over here. You can see we have the username displaying up here. I'll click log out. Takes us back to the login page. We can also sign up. So I'll say video@example.com with a password. And I'll leave the second password blank. You can see it says to fill out all the fields. I'll just throw two different passwords in here. Doesn't work. I'll say maybe we can do, well, we'll create this account first so you can see this works. So that worked for video@example.com. I'll log out and I'll come over to create account and I'll say, I don't know, test@case.com, which already exists. And I'll give it a password length that has two missing or one character each. So you can see the email's already taken and we're also validating the length at the same time. And then we clear the field so that the user isn't exposing their passwords or whatever security concerns are. Of course, we can come over to the login page. We can try test@case.com and we'll just type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's not going to work. And we just return invalid credentials because we don't want people to know that one of the accounts already exists. I just think that's a little bit safer. The forgot password we're not going to be implementing in this video, but we'll be covering the create and the logins. Okay, so that's very long-winded. And the reason why is this is a very long tutorial. To start with this tutorial, we're going to be coming over to this GitHub repo, which I'll have a link to in the video description. We're going to be using a modified version of the Doorkeeper project that we created in the previous tutorial, which I'll have a link to in the video description. Basically, this is a backend Rails app, and this application allows you to log in with either Devise, like we're doing right here, or with the API refresh tokens. And the actual application will issue client IDs and client secrets, which you'll have to pass along as well to access the React client, which is a specific application that we're creating inside of Doorkeeper to allow the React app to work. So you can test all of this, and we did it previously with an application like Postman, where you can pass in a whole bunch of requests and see what the responses are like. But there's also another option, which is you can click on these documentation links. Now for the bookstore, I just created a basic set of documentation, which is just sort of testing out Swagger. It's nothing really fancy. There's really not a lot here. But for the actual Doorkeeper API, if we click on that, this has a lot more detail. So here's your 3 endpoints. If you're trying to register a user, you're going to go to /users. If you're trying to either log in with the username and password, or if you're trying to refresh your token, so you only have a refresh token because you refresh the page, so you pass that back, your grant type is then a refresh token, and instead of email and password, you just have that token. It'll then pass back an access token and a new refresh token. You can then use that to access the rest of the app. If you want to log out, you're going to pass your refresh token or your access token back here, and it's going to say, okay, we're done here, and it's going to, revoke the permissions for those tokens. So those won't work anymore. So that's your login functionality, your logout functionality, and your register functionality. And then down here, you can see that there's a whole bunch of schemas that you can look through. So that's all very helpful. Those links are on the homepage. Now, the other thing to note is that the APIs are scoped based on version. So we're going to be working off of like V1, V2, V3. For this video, it's just all going to be V1. I can actually open up the routes real quick so you can see what that looks like. If we come into the backend and the config, we have the routes.rb. We have the rswag stuff, which is just for the documentation, the root page, Doorkeeper routes, Devise routes, resources for the books, and then we draw this API, which is this routes folder right here, which contains these routes. Let me move this down. Inside of these routes, you have a namespace API, namespace v1, which means all of your routes are going to be localhost port 3000 /API /v1 /whatever. Your users are going to scope to a registrations create action, which is we'll cover in a second. Your resources right here are also scoped under API v1, but as you saw previously, we also have books at the Rails level inside the regular routes. That allows us to have this books route right here. And if you wanted, you could have a second controller, which I'll move to real quick, which is under app controllers API books controller, which looks similar to the regular books controller, but it inherits from API controller, which if we look at that, causes you to do a before action Doorkeeper authorize, which is the same thing as current user. If we come back to the routes, also have a namespace for Android routes, which we're not implementing yet, but this is just essentially you can think of this project right here as like a backend for Frontend, where you have multiple different ways to facilitate the distribution of data to different clients. So you might have an Android client and the React client. The React client might consume the normal API. The Android client might need a separate API. So we have a separate namespace for that. We also have a get/users/me, which goes to the user's controller inside of API v1. And what this does is it checks if there is a current user, which we are defining by calling current user, which is inside of API controller. How it works is if there is no Doorkeeper token, it'll return, but if there is one, it'll try to find the user by that resource owner ID, and if it finds it, it'll set it inside of @current-user. We then take that, and whenever we go to the API v1/me location, you're going to see the render of the current user, which is going to pass back the user ID, email, role, and the created at, and to stop React from throwing a fit because the created at isn't serializable, we are passing it back as a .iso 8601, which is a really long-winded way to say that if I log in as test@case.com, we have the created at being displayed right here. So this data inside of this API v1 users controller where we render the current user is what this data right here is. Of course, a lot of this is quite a bit to take in. So what I'll do is as we step through the entire React application, which is what we're going to be focusing on, I'll move over to the Rails app as we go. The other thing I want to point out is the application template that we're going to be using has continuous integration enabled. So whatever you push this to, as long as your .github workflows folder right here stays at the root of your application, and your Rails app stays inside of the backend, whenever you push changes, you'll have this action run. And if I open up this action, it'll run your tests and your spec. and it will run a rubocop linter. If you don't want to remember how to run the rubocop linter, inside of the backend folder, there is a scripts folder which has a rubocop.sh file in it, which just calls the rubocop clean up my code command. There is also a swagger.sh, which you can use to call the rake specs swagger eyes. If you want to use those, you just cd into the backend folder of your project, type / let me full screen this, scripts, and then whichever one you want to run. So I'll run the rubocop script just by doing that. And you can see right here, if I bump this up, 91 files inspected, no offenses found. So that's working. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to grab this application and we're going to clone it. So we'll just take this, clone it, cd out of here, and we'll leave the demos folder and I'll move into my YouTube folder. Oops. For a React series, we'll just create a directory, make dir React dash wishlist, cd React dash wishlist, and then we're going to do a git clone this into here. So we do the dot there. That way, when it clones it into this specific directory. So now we have a backend folder. This backend folder is our Rails app. So if we cd into the backend folder and run a Rails test, it will run some tests that we have inside of the application. All of our tests are passing, and we can run a Rails spec as well. And you can see here 7 examples. I'm going to go over to my VS Code here, and I'm going to move this over so I can read it. And then I'm going to cd out of the backend, and then inside of here, I'm going to type a code dot, which is just going to allow us to work in this project. The other thing we need to do is this is a Git project. We just cloned it. What we're going to do is we're going to do an LL. We're going to do an rm-rf.git to get rid of our Git folder. We're going to cd into backend just to check and make sure there's no secret Git folder in here, which there isn't. And now what we'll do is we'll do a git init, git status. Looks good. We'll do a git add dot, git commit -m init commit, git push, but we don't have a repo added. So for this, we'll create a new repository in GitHub. We'll call this the React-wishlist. We'll call it the React-wishlist-series, I guess. And then we'll just hit create. And then we can copy this section right here, paste it into our VS Code, and then hit enter. And that will run it. And then we can refresh the React wishlist series. And we now have our application up here. If we come over to actions, you'll see that our GitHub action is already running. And it's just running the test and the lint. Of course, those will pass because we just checked. At this point, we're now ready to get started with the React app. So for the React app, we need to bump up the font size quite a bit. And we need to run npx create -react-app. We're going to call it Frontend. And then we're going to say -- template is Redux -TypeScript, because we're going to be using Redux and TypeScript for this. Okay, we have finished our npx command. We can now cd into the front end. And inside of here, we now need to run a couple of commands because we're going to add material UI. So we're going to run npm install @mui/material @emotion/react @emotion/styled. That adds our material UI. We now need to do a npm install @mui/icons-material. And I know it's not really efficient to do those commands separately. That's just how I have them in my notes. And the last one we're going to do is a npm install ESLint --save-dev. And we're going to run a npm init @ESLint/config. And it's going to ask us some questions. We're going to go with just check syntax and find problems. We're going to go with JavaScript modules. Then we'll click on React. Yes, it uses TypeScript. Runs in the browser. Which format do you want your config file in? We'll go with JavaScript because that's what a lot of tutorials are in. Would you like to install them now with npm? Sure. And we now have ESLint. At this point, we can cd out of here, do a git status. You'll see that the front end folder has been created. So we're going to do a git add .git commit -m create initial front end project. And we'll do a git push to push that up. Now from this point forward, because it's a lot easier to keep track of progress, we're going to do some git checkouts to just run off of branches. So we're going to type git checkout -b. We'll call this first one, I don't know, the login branch. So this is going to be where we write our login code. So we're now inside the login branch. So we'll cd into the front end of the folder. Then we'll come over here. Now the first thing we should do is run a npm run start command. That will start our front end application, but it's going to start it on localhost port 3000. What I'd like to do instead is close this and we'll run the Rails server first. I'll open up my VS Code and hit Control-Shift-tilde to open up the terminal. And then in here, I think you can also go up here to like terminal and just open up the terminal like that. In here, we're going to cd into the backend and run a Rails, and we're going to run a Rails db setup command to set up the database. I already have it because of my other application. So I'm going to run a Rails db drop command. Okay, and now I'll do a Rails db setup. And I know you could do like a reset command there, but this just seems like a slightly safer way to go. Now I'm going to do a Rails S, and that will start my server on port 3000 for the Rails app. So I'm going to come over to the Rails app, refresh. Here you can see we have a React client with a client ID and a client secret already created for us. That happens in the backend in the DB seeds. If inside of our seeds folder right here, it's just going to run whatever the default case is, which is the development. So we'll come into seeds development.rb, and inside of the development folder, you can see that it checks if there are no applications, then I'm going to do a Doorkeeper application create, where I create a React client. I'm also going to find or create a user. So if the user doesn't exist, I'll create it, which is just dean@example.com with a password of password, and the admin role is set. So that's how we create an admin user. So all of that set up for us. If we come over here and we do a dean@example.com with a password of password, you can see we're logged in here, and we can click on the webhooks. And in here, it says my role is an admin and I can create books. We're not going to be using the books in this tutorial, but in future videos, we'll be doing something similar. And then if we come over to port 3001, we're going to want to run the npm run start command. And here it's going to ask us if we're cool with using a different port because 3000 is busy. We'll hit yes, and it'll open it up in 3001. And then this is what our app's going to look like. So let me just refresh this. So this is our starting page. The reason why I like this template is because inside of front end source, you have a features folder, and inside that features folder, you have an example of how they set up a counter with Redux and TypeScript. So you have a complete slice here set up in their Redux store and a component and everything else. Now we don't really need that, but if you want it, it is there. The first thing we're going to do is grab this features folder, and we're just going to put it inside of app. That's going to break some stuff. So we need to full screen our VS Code, and all of these things that we have open, just hit Control S on them because it changed the imports. Hopefully it changed the imports for you. We just need to save it so that those files save. And now our application is up and running again. And we can, of course, do all of these fun buttons, and they work just fine. So now let's full screen this and let's get to work. Inside of our app.css file, we are going to actually just empty this for now. We don't need those. Our Index.tsx we'll leave alone. That one's fine. And then we'll close all of this. Inside of our Index.tsx file, we're going to get a slight warning because of how it's creating this React element. So what we're going to do is we're going to paste this in where we say const root element equals document.getElementById. And then we're grabbing the root element. And then we're going to say root is from the React DOM. app.createRoot, root element as HTML element. And then this needs to not be ReactDom, but ReactDom/client. Now it's going to be unhappy about that, but then we can come down here and replace this with a root. That'll get rid of some of the errors that we're going to see. Oops, this actually needs to be ReactDom. And then if we hover over this, we can click quick fix and it'll say install at types/ReactDom. We'll click that. And now it's taking care of that. So the last thing we want to do here is not this document.getElementById. Instead, we'll just leave it like this. And now that's just sort of a under the surface thing that happens. But this one right here actually needs to be React lowercase dom, and this needs to be React lowercase dom because I don't know what I'm doing. So let's stop the server and restart it. And it's going to do the same thing again where it asks us if we're okay with using a different port. We could, of course, change the command, but for now, this is fine. And now our application is okay. It's just a little bit resized. So we now have that change fixed. So now it's time to move on out of our index file. Of course, in our app.tsx file, we have that default boilerplate being created. We're going to grab all of this inside of this header, and we're just going to get rid of it. Now, inside of this header, we're going to create a component, which we're going to call AppBar / and we're going to close it. We can also get rid of these imports. And the way that I like to grab these app bars is I come over to Google, I search for Material UI React, takes me to a MUI.com page. I click Getting Started. And then in here, I search for AppBar. This is basically Bootstrap, if you're familiar with Bootstrap. And then I scroll down until I find one that I like. In this case, I like this AppBar with responsive menu. So I click the two little angle brackets. I grab the TypeScript version, and then I click copy from source. I then come over here, and inside of our app, we have the features folder. And inside of features, I create a new folder. I call this AppBar. And inside of AppBar, I create a new file that I call appbar.tsx. I then paste in the appbar.tsx, and I come back over to here. And I do a control dot on this app bar. And after you wait a little bit, sometimes you'll find it, you can add the import to the top. So here it says import app bar from app features app bar. And then we can save this. And now you can see here we're getting this React must be in scope when using JSX ESLint. So we have to come into our ESLint.rc. And inside of here, we need to replace the rules. I'm going to paste in these rules real quick, and then we can talk about them. First one is, basically it's just a JSON format. All you're going to do is you're going to say React/React-in-JSX-scope is set to off. And then you're going to say React JSX file extension. You're going to change it to .ts and .tsx. You can then save that. And now our app is no longer going to throw a fit. The module exports is just going to stay red. It doesn't like it for some reason, but we don't care. And now we're good to go. So if we exit out of this, we come back to our application. We're now probably going to have to restart. I'm going to hit Y. And now we have our app bar here. So I'm going to keep it around 140% scroll just so that it's a bit easier to see what we're doing. So the first thing we need to figure out is how we're going to do the routing, because in Rails, we have that lovely routes folder. Here we really don't. While inside of our app.tsx, we can sort of create the same structure. We just need to install the React router DOM. So to do this, we're going to exit out of here. We'll stop the server, and then we'll just type npm I react-router-dom. We'll hit enter. Now, instead of just running this again, what we'll do is we'll come into our package.json. Let me full screen this. And what we can do is we can say port equals 3001, React scripts start inside of our start. And then we can come out of here and run a npm run start. And of course, my terminal is looking a little weird. And you can see here, it just starts it on 3001. If I was a smarter person, I'd change it to open with Brave instead of Chrome every time, but I never learned my lesson. Okay, so now we can close that and we'll be good to no longer have to do that. Now we have the React router. Let's get started with creating our routes. So the first thing we're gonna do is up here outside in our app, we want to consider what the app is. We have the header, so we're going to want a main. So we're going to say main. We don't need to give it a class. So this will be separate from the rest of our application. The one thing we don't want to do though is set it so that our user account login, logout logic affects the AppBar itself. We can do some checks inside of the AppBar, which are going to be a little bit redundant with the rest of the application, but it'll allow the AppBar to just render fine if it's if the user's not logged in. So what we'll do up here is we'll say this is where the router starts, and the router is going to end at the bottom here by this div. We can then hit Control dot on the router, add an import from React Router DOM, which it adds up here. We then have our header. Then inside of our main, we need to have some routes. Now these routes also need to be imported with a Control dot. Then in the routes, we're going to have a separate route. This route is going to have an element, and this one's going to be called persist login, but we don't need it to be a complete component, so we can do that. Then inside of this route, we're going to have a path. It's going to be a route with a path equal to slash and an element equal to, and this is going to be a private route, which we haven't created yet. This is a custom component. And then inside of that, we'll create a dashboard component. We then come down here and we close off our route from up top. And then we can hit save, I think. We can come right here for this route. We're going to hit Control dot, import the route. That will hopefully fix some of the other problems we're running into. We then have the persist login component, which we need to create. The persist login component is going to be inside of a feature. So we're going to right click on our features folder and we're going to call this the sessions feature. Now the sessions feature is going to have quite a few different components in it. It's going to have a login.tsx component, which we'll create. We'll type RFCE, hit tab, and then hit Control S. If you're wondering how I'm doing that, go over to the extensions and you're going to want to look for the React ES7 React Redux extension, which is going to have a whole bunch of useful snippets. You just type the same abbreviation I did, and then you hit tab and it'll autocomplete for you. We're then going to create another component. We're going to call this the logout.tsx. Create another component. We'll call this the persist login.tsx component. I forgot to do this. We'll come into logout. We'll say RFCE. We'll hit tab. We'll hit Control S. We'll come into persist login, RFCE, tab, Control S. Just a really quick way to stub this out. We'll then create another one. We'll call it session slice.tsx. This one's going to be its own monster that we have to deal with, but for now, we'll just leave it as a RFCE. This is going to change. We then come into here, create a new file, signup.tsx, RFCE, hit tab, Control S. And then the last one is our update profile page that we're not going to create in this tutorial, but we can at least Control S it with a RFCE for now, just so it's stubbed out. So now we're going to close all of those, and that'll let us continue on the app.tsx. So our persist login needs to be imported. We'll import that. And then we have this private route. This is going to be inside of the features, but we call this one the routes feature. And inside of the routes feature, we'll create a private route.tsx. And in here, we'll do an RFCE again. We'll just save that. We can come over here, hit Control dot, and then do a Control S for that one. Now we have this dashboard right here, which we'll create a folder for. We'll call it dashboard. And inside of that dashboard folder, we'll create a dashboard.tsx. And then there we'll do, you guessed it, RFCE, Control S, and then Control W to close that. Control dot on the dashboard. And then we'll go down to import it. We can hit Control S. And now our private route is going to be upset because of how this is constructed. So we're going to have to come into the private route first to fix this. Now, the last thing we want to do before we actually go into the private route is this router is upset because this import for the router, we're going to change it. So we're going to actually backspace this. And then at the start here, we're going to type import the browser router as router. And that will replace the errors. So now we just have the private route to deal with. So let's open up the private route. And in here, this is going to take a list of children, which are going to need a type. And for the type, if GitHub Copilot would stop helping, we're going to set it to any for now. Don't worry, we'll actually be using TypeScript in this tutorial. It's just for right now, we're going to use any. So what we want to do here is basically we want to check if we have an access token. So we're going to say const access token is equal to, and for now, we're just going to set this to, I guess, false. So we don't have an access token. And then we're going to have a const for loading, which for now we're going to set to false. So we're not loading anything. And then down here, what we'll do is instead of just doing a return, we're going to say if we have an access token, then we want to return children. Else if we are loading, so if loading is true, then we're going to return a div, or I guess a p tag maybe, that says loading ... Else if we don't have an access token and we don't have and we're not loading, then we're not logged in. Else, I don't know, man. We're just going to say something went wrong. If you're in this block, you done goofed somehow. So we'll just leave it like that for now. So basically, if you have an access token, you're going to go to whatever route you're trying to, because it means you're logged in. This is synonymous with being logged in. If you're loading, it means you could be logged in, but we don't know yet. So for now, we're just going to display a loading thing, or you could put in like a loading GIF with a little cogwheel that turns. If you don't have an access token and you're not loading, it means you're not logged in. In this case, you probably want to be directed to like /login, right? If you don't satisfy the case where you either are or aren't logged in and you are or aren't loading, then I don't know what to tell you. In that case, you're just going to this last block. Now for this else if here with the you are not logged in, we'd probably want to render something. But for now, what we can do is we can actually play with this. So I'll come over here, I'll refresh the page. It says persist login. So if we come back to our app.tsx, our persist login element here is stopping the rest of this from rendering. So what we'll do is we'll come into our persist login inside of sessions, persist login. We'll full screen this. And basically what we're going to do in here is we're going to have another const for loading, which we're going to set to false for now. We're going to have a const for our access token, which we're going to set to false for now. We're going to have a const for a refresh token, which we're going to set to, I guess, just null for now so that we don't have one. And then we're going to do a use effect, which is going to take in an anonymous function. And we only want this to run whenever the access token or the refresh token change. So we're going to do comma, and we're going to pass in the access token and the refresh token. Now in this case, they're not going to change, they're static, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense, but in the future, it might, it'll change and then we'll have things to update. In here, we're going to do a function for verify refresh token. And basically what we want to do is we want to try to call a dispatch to the store where we do a call to refresh the access token, where we pass in a refresh token. This is what we'll do later. For now, we're just going to leave this commented out, and we're going to do a console.log where we say refreshing access token. If that doesn't work, we have to catch something, which is going to be an error, and then we're just going to console log error refreshing access token. After those are done, we then at the bottom here check if we don't have an access token, then we want to call verify refresh token. Of course, nothing's going to change here, but that's at least going to work. And then down here, after we're out of this, we're then going to do a return, where we're going to return a HTML or a React fragment. And we're going to check if we're loading. If we're loading, we then want to return a p tag that says loading ... Else we're not loading. And in that case, let's return an outlet. We're going to hit Control dot on the outlet to import it from React Router DOM. You can now hit Control S on that, come over here and refresh. And now it's telling us that we are not logged in. So where does that come from? Well, remember in our private route right here, if we don't have an access token and we're not loading, then it's going to say you're not logged in. If we do have a access token, it's going to take us to the dashboard. If we don't have an access token, but we are loading, then it'll say we're loading. If we're not loading the private route, but persist login is loading because it's refreshing the access token, it'll say we're loading. So you can see there sort of how it toggles between all of those. But in the private route, instead of saying you're not logged in, what I'd like to do is have it send us to a set location. So there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to use a slightly messier one, but you basically have two options. The first one is you can come in here and you can say navigate to /login. And then you come up here and you say const navigate equals use navigate. And of course you need to import use navigate. So you control dot, import it from the React router DOM, you hit save, and you don't actually need to return navigate. So now you can see it sends us to /login. Well, I mean, this is a tutorial for Ant, so you can't read it, but this is where it sends us. The other option that you have is you can do and I'm going to leave this commented out for now. I'm not actually too familiar with React, so I'm not sure which of these is better, but you can create a const from location, which is going to be equal to location.state as any (from). And this is going to basically cast this location.state as any because it comes back in a weird type. And now we need to actually define location. So we're going to say const location is equal to use location. And that of course means we need to run a control dot again to import this from React router DOM. We then do a const previous location equals location.state ? If it had a location.state, we then want to do from location, which is what we did up here. Else we want to send them to path name : /login. We'll come down here. And what we'll do is I'll leave the original option, but we'll return a navigate with a 2 equal to the previous location, a state equal to from : location, and then we'll say replace. And if we come over here, we can do a control dot, import from React router DOM. Now, if we hover over this, you can see that you have a function, navigate, which takes in a 2, a replace, and a state. And if you want to see more on this, you click on this little link right here. Now, of course, you can take this and you can do navigate. You can do navigate to /login, or you can do navigate to previous location. Actually, let me leave it with this. I'm going to comment this out. And we're going to do and we're going to do navigate to the previous location, comma, and then our state, which is our from location. Now, personally, I'm more a fan of doing just doing this navigate to, or doing a regular navigate call. So for now, we're just going to leave it as this navigate to right here. Just wanted to give you a couple different options. So now if we come back here and we try to go to our dashboard, we're going to be sent to our login page. Now we can come over to the login page, and actually we can stop the server real quick and we'll say git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say something like added routing and persist login components. And then we can run a npm run start command, and then we can exit out of full screen. Now inside of our login component, you're going to have to bear with me because this is one of our bigger files. Basically, we need to come up here. We can get rid of the import React. We don't need that. We need to start with a const email ref equal to a use ref, and then we need to import this. We'll import it from React. Now this is going to need a specific type, but I'll show you how I figure out what the type is in a second here. We're going to grab an password ref. Then we're going to need a error message. And actually the error messages are going to be stored as an array because the Rails API can return multiple for the signup page. So I just use the same logic across the app. What I'll do is I'll say const error messages equals, and then for now what we'll do is we'll just say use state, and we'll make it an empty array, and it's going to be an array of strings. So in here we can say this is a string array. Now for the use state, we want to hit control dot, enter, and then we can save that. Now after the error messages, we have const, and this is going to be errors, comma, set errors, which is going to be equal to use state. This is also going to be a string array, which is going to have a array in it. We can then do a const for show password and set show password, which is going to be equal to use state, which is just going to be false by default. And this is going to be a Boolean. See, I told you we'd use some TypeScript eventually. We then have const loading, which is going to be equal to just false for now. And we're going to have a const navigate equals use navigate. And we're going to have a const dispatch equals use dispatch. So for the navigate, we hit control dot, import it. For the dispatch, we hit control dot. And this little blue light bulb, that's usually the one you want to look for after it finds out that there's a local import for this. And now we're good with that. So now we want to create a use effect where we pass in an anonymous function. And then we want to, first of all, set the email ref dot, email ref question mark dot current question mark dot focus. We'll just do some optional chaining there. And then after we do that, we want to check if error messages dot length is greater than 0. That means we have some error messages. I need to get rid of this. GitHub Copilot's helping. We then want to call set errors, where we set the errors to be the list of messages. Actually, I just realized that I did a use state here. We don't actually need that. We're going to just use a empty array. And the reason why we're just using an empty array for that is because this is going to be coming from our Redux store in the future. So for now, it's just going to be an array of strings, and then we'll grab it from the store later. Now we can't, of course, call focus on this yet because it doesn't exist. After we do this errors, we then need to do a dispatch to the store where we reset error state. And the reason why is because of our private route and our persist login. Whenever we go into a state of loading, which will happen as the application sends off that request to try and log in. It'll go to that state of loading. It'll come back here and you'll lose whatever your errors were. And it just makes sense to grab them from the store. So you reset them after you grab them. That way, if you go to like the sign up page and the sign up page has the same logic, it won't display the same errors. But for now, we can't actually reset them. So instead, what we'll do is we'll just say error messages equals the empty array. And we need to change this from a const to a let because of how the code is working out right now. Okay, so now that we have that, we now need to come down here and we need to create a couple inputs. So we have a password input, which is going to be equal to a whole bunch of HTML. And the reason why is because, as you saw, the password input has a bunch of buttons on it, like to show and hide the password and stuff. So we're going to use some material UI here. We're going to create an outlined input. And then at the end here, we'll do a semicolon. So the outlined input will be our wrapper. And then we need to do a control dot to import this from material UI. And then inside of this, we want to do a ID equal to password, a type equal to, and the type can either be of type text or type password. The text is the stuff that's visible and the password is the stuff that's just like the asterisk. So what we do, because we have this little show password state up here, is we check if show password is true. If it's true, set it to text because you want to see the actual words of the password and the letters. Else, leave it as type password. So by default, it'll be hidden, but if you click the button, it'll change it to text. We then set an input ref equal to the password ref, which we defined up here. We then, at the end here, create an end adornment, and then we set this equal to some braces. And then inside of here, we create an adornment, which is that little eyeball button. So for this, there is a type of component from MUI that we can say input adornment position is equal to end, which puts it at the end of the input. We then need to import this adornment, and then we can create a icon button. This icon button is going to look like this, and inside of it, we're going to give it a aria-label equal to toggle password visibility. It's going to have an on-click equal to set show password, which is going to be not show password, which is just going to invert it. It's then going to have an on mouse down equal to the same thing, basically. We grab that same thing, copy, pasta, and we're good. And then at the end here, we're going to say edge equals end. And this will close. And then right here, we do show password question mark. If it's true, we say visibility, which is from MUI icons, which I remembered to import, right? Yeah, okay. And otherwise it's visibility off. And this is just, one is the eye and one is like a closed eye. So it just changes the appearance of the button basically. And then after all of those are imported, we hit Control S and hopefully some of our errors go away. Those went away. Icon button still needs to be imported though. And down here, we can just do a slash and then we can get rid of this last one. And now our errors are gone. At this point, we can now use this inside of our return, but we need to actually style the rest of the return, which is going to be quite a bit of boilerplate. So what we'll do is we'll, I guess, get started by creating a div, or we can create a section if we want to keep things a bit more fancy. Inside of here, we're then going to create, and I'm going to start copy pasting little snippets just so that it's a bit more bearable because we don't want to be here all day. We're going to create a container, which we have to import. We can import that from MUI. Inside of that container, we're going to create a card. Inside of that card, we'll create a card content. Inside of that card content, we'll create a container. A max width equal to SM. And then we want to import the card content. And then inside of the card container, or inside of the container here, we're going to put in a typography, which we need to import. We'll import that. Now we're going to come down here and we're going to check if we have any errors. So we're going to say errors dot length greater than 0. Not this. I don't know what GitHub Copilot's trying to do. So if it's greater than 0, if I can do this without GitHub Copilot helping, that would be great. And then we'll put this over here. If it's greater than 0, we then want to do a alert with a severity equal to error and an aria-live equal to assertive. And then inside of here, we want to do a errors.map, where we map each error and the index, and then we can close it down here with something like that. And then for each of these, we want to return a p tag, and it's going to look like this. So we have the p tag with a key set to alert dash index. The index is right here. It's just our iterator. And then inside of the actual alert, we have the error contents, which is just going to be like the string that's inside of the array, basically. We then come down here where we have our alert. And if we don't have any, if we're not greater than 0, so we're set to 0, we'll just return a HTML fragment. After that, we have a form with a on submit, which we're just going to set equal to handle submit. And then in here, and again, I would suggest probably refactoring some of this code, in the future. It's just right now, this is the easiest way to cover all of this instead of making, hundreds of different components. But for this form, we're going to have multiple form groups, which are going to look like this. And basically each form group is going to have, it's going to be set to row true, which is what causes it to take up the entire width of the login page. It's going to have an ID equal to whatever that group is. So this is going to be our email group, and it's going to have a margin top set to 1 EM, which is just going to give it 1 EM worth of margin on the top, basically. So it keeps them a little bit from getting bunched up. We're then going to have a form control set to full width. And then we of course need to import that. We're then going to have a input label, which is literally just a label. We set required HTML for the email. And then we're going to have a input, which is going to be set to the email ref in this case. So I guess we need to import these, import that one, and then we'll import this input right here. And then we need to basically copy this a couple times. I guess in this case, we only copy it once, and we're going to replace the emails with a password in this one. So it's going to be the password group. HTML is going to be for password. It's going to be the password label. And this is just going to say password. And instead of this input, we're going to put in, you guessed it, the password input. And after that, we can come out of this form group and we can create another form group with a row of true. It's going to be a submit group, a margin top of 1 EM. GitHub Copilot knows me so well. Oops. And then we close the form group. Okay, well, now it's not being as helpful. We then want another form control, which we can close like that. And then inside of this form control, we need a login button, which I'm going to paste in and then reformat because my formatter is not working right now. So this button is going to have a disabled state whenever the application is loading. It's going to have a variant of contained, a color of primary, a type of submit, and an ID of submit button. You then come all the way down here below the form, the container, the card content, but still inside the card. We can create a divider with a light equal to false. We can hit Control dot on that divider to import it. And then we're going to have a set of card actions. In the card actions, we're going to have a box, which we're just going to close right here, /box. Inside of this box, we're going to have a typography, and it's going to be a link to the forgot password link. Again, this isn't going to be implemented yet, but this is just what the actual link is going to look like. And now we need to import all of these things. And actually, I just realized there's a better button I should be using for this. You could be using add all missing imports, but I don't trust it sometimes. So I'm going to hit Control dot on each of these just in case it tries to import it from somewhere weird. And then after that typography and that link, we're then going to include a link to /signup that says create account. And assuming we did all of that correctly, the only thing that's left to break on us is the handles submit. So we do need to create that. So if we exit out here, see, focus doesn't exist and handle submit doesn't exist. So we know about those. So we're going to grab this handle submit and we're going to create this function, which is going to happen up top here. So we're going to say async function handle submit, which is going to take in an event. And in here, there's a whole bunch of logic we need to do. The first thing we want to do is set prevent default and set errors. So we call event.preventDefault. We call set errors and set it to just the empty array. We then need to do a whole host of checks to see if the email ref is empty. So we say if email ref.current is undefined, or if it is equal to the empty string, so current.value, or if passwordref.current is undefined, or if passwordref.current.value is equal to the empty string. I don't know if you need both of those. It's just what my spaghetti code had at that time. Then if any of those are true, you're going to have to set the errors So it's going to be please fill out all fields because we don't know which one of these was empty. So we're just going to say fill out all fields because if you didn't fill one out, you probably want to start over anyways. Now here it's telling us that the property value doesn't exist on the current. And the reason why it doesn't exist on the email ref current is because the email ref needs to have a specific type. And all of these are of type input element. So we're going to change it to HTML input element. We can save that. It'll fix our focus problem and it'll get rid of those problems. Now our event here is upset and this event needs to be a different type. This is going to be I wish I wasn't making this up. It's going to be a React.form event of type HTML form event. Now that'll take care of that error. So now what we want to do is say const payload is equal to, we're going to create an object. We're going to give it an email set to the email.ref.value. And then we're going to give it a password set to the password ref.current.value. Then we're going to come down here and we're going to say const response equals await. I actually don't know if we need to do this, but we'll do it anyways. We need to dispatch to the login user the payload. We're going to return it as any because it could come back with errors. We can then do a console.log for the response, which in this case isn't going to come back with anything because we're going to have to comment it out. And we can do a check if, basically if error messages is equal to undefined, then we want to call navigate slash, actually this should be fine. So we'll leave it as just the check for the length. I think that's a better way to do this. We'll come in here and we'll just replace this stuff in the if statement with a check on the length. And we'll say else. We had some errors, so then we want to return set errors, which is going to be set to error messages. So now we need this login user method, but for now what we'll do is we'll just comment this out and we'll say const response equals oops, something went wrong, and we'll save that, which will give it a length greater than 0, which should set us to this set errors. So we'll come back here, refresh, and nothing's showing up. So let's hit Control-Shift-I, and it's telling us no route matches /login. So why does no route match it? Well, if we come over to our private route, this is clearly working. Our persist login is clearly working, but if you come into your App.tsx, we only created something for the root path here. So we need a couple more routes, and I'm just going to paste them in because it's pretty much the same as this first one. The first one's going to be a protected route that's going to be to the logout component. We'll import, oops. And that's why you have to be careful. You'll not import the MUI, but you'll import the features session logout. We then have one for our update profile component, which we'll hit Control-on to import. And then we can tab this over. And then we have two for the sign in and the sign out routes. And these two are wrapped inside of a public only route because we need to do some different logic to make sure that we go to those routes. Now, I don't know if this is necessary. Again, I'm not like a super big React developer. I only know basically what I learn as I make these videos because I don't really use React or Rails professionally. Basically, we're going to come over to our router or a routes folder. We're going to create a new file, call this public route.tsx. We're going to copy the private route, paste it into the public route, and we'll rename this to public route. We'll save this, and then we'll hit Control dot to import it. I just realized we need to rename this to public only route, and this needs to be public only route. We can come in here, and now we can hit Control dot on the public only route to import it. Okay, so the difference between the public only route and the private route is we are first checking if we don't have an access token and we're not loading. In that case, we return children. Else, if we're loading, we return loading. If we do have an access token and we're not loading, we then want to navigate to the previous location. And if you get to the else part, again, something went wrong. I don't know how you managed to do all of this without hitting one of the first three cases. So we can save this. We'll come over to the private route and we'll just get rid of the use navigate because we're not using it right now. You can, of course, get rid of the capital N navigate if you're using use navigate instead. So now we can come over to the login, and we should have the login page rendering. So here's what it looks like. I'll zoom out a bit and we can test it. So we'll say test at case.com with a password of password, and nothing's going to happen. If we hit Control-Shift-I, it's just a little bit upset with us. What we can try to do is say test at case.com. We'll leave the password blank. Tells us to fill out all fields. You can say set it to password, and we'll click the little I, and that causes it to appear. And I have a browser extension installed. It's the React developer tools. And if you go over to components after you install it, assuming you can read this, and you click on the little view settings button, you can change it to highlight component or highlight updates when components render, which allows you to see the updates as they happen. But now we have that set, we can click login and nothing will happen. The reason why is because our response right here is completely stubbed out. We can come over to our create account button though, and that'll be our sign up page. And thankfully, the login page was a pain, but the sign up page is going to be a Control-A, Control-C, a Control-V, and then we're going to have to rename this to sign up, and we need to change our export to sign up. We can save that. We scroll up to the top here. We need one more ref. This is going to be a password confirmation ref. We can save that. Our error messages stay as an array. Our errors stay, our show password stays, our loading, our navigate, and our dispatch all stay. This logic in here stays the same. Our handle submit gets 2 extra checks in here, which is for password confirmation checks that are similar to the rest. It gets a second check to see if the passwordref.current.value does not equal the password confirmation.ref.current.value or whatever, in which case we tell them the passwords don't match, because we're doing that whole thing where you have to type in your password twice to make sure that you really want to set your password to that. Because we do this check on the client side, we don't have to send the password twice in the payload. Our response here is basically the same thing. We do a navigate if we don't have any errors. I just realized this doesn't really make sense, does it? We want this to be if the error messages .length is equal to 0, then we navigate, else we set the errors. Probably makes more sense that way. So we'll save that. And then we leave the set errors. Now we can come over here to the, let's go to the login page again. We can do test at case.com with a password of password. That works. If we come over to the create account, we need to change this text, and we need to add in the password confirmation and change this text. So if we scroll down here, we have this password input. We're going to copy this. We're going to paste it, and we're going to change this to password confirmation input. Our ID is going to be password-confirmation. Our input ref is going to be password confirmation ref. We leave it with the same visibility, because if you toggle one, you're going to want to toggle both, I'd imagine. And then we leave the rest of these alone. Now we come down here. This needs to be create, and this needs to be sign up. The errors stay the same. We leave the email address, but here we add a little extra. So in our form control, we add something that says form helper text, and then I'll wait for it to be able to import, where we set an ID equal to email helper text, and then we say will never share your email. And this is just the code to escape a apostrophe. And we'll hit Control dot on this to import the helper text eventually. Now we have our password group, which has the password input, and then we just copy paste that. We give it a password -confirmation group, which we can copy. It's going to be HTML for a password still, or it can be HTML for the password confirmation. It's going to be a password confirmation label. We'll set this to password confirmation. And this is going to be a password confirmation input. For our button, we're going to change this to create account. And then down here, instead of these, we're going to replace the contents of this box with just a link to the login page. It just says already have an account, and then you link to /login. So come over here, and now this is our sign up page. So we say sign up, email address, password, password confirmation. If you already have an account, you go over to login, which takes you to here. Create an account. You can say test@case.com. We'll leave the passwords blank. It says fill out all fields. So we'll say password 1, password 2. You can show and hide these so you can see they're different. I'll click create. It says passwords don't match. If they're both the same, it's going to just redirect us to the login page because, and this is a little bit confusing, but basically that works. So our error message length is 0, which sends us to the root of the application. But because our persist login and our private route both don't think we have an access token, those then redirect us to the login page. So that's why we're coming back here. Basically, we need to set up the logic to actually be logged in now that we have these forms. And the way we do that is with these calls to this dispatch. And this is where we're going to add in the Redux portion of the application. But first, I want to exit out of the application. I want to cd to the front of it. So it's going to be our React WishList, and I'm going to run a git status. You can see this is the stuff that we've added here when we did the login. So I'm going to say git add dot, git commit dash m, add login sign up functionality. And it's just the front end functionality, but we'll pretend. And then I'll run a git push, which is telling us to add this git push dash dash upstream. So I always just highlight it, right click again, and that will push it up to the login branch. We can come over to our React wishlist series. We're going to hit compare and pull request. We'll create a pull request for the login functionality, and it'll run our checks on our Rails app. Of course, these are all going to pass because we haven't changed the Rails app. So I'm going to be a bad boy here, and I'm just going to click merge pull request before it's done. And I'll click confirm merge, which puts it into the main branch. Now we can come over to our terminal. We'll do a git checkout main. We can then do a git fetch. We can then do a git status, which tells us we're behind main by 3 commits. So we'll do a git pull. That pulls in all of our changes that we just did, which, I mean, look at how much code we've already written. And now we can do a git checkout dash b, and we'll call this, I don't know, session slice, because we're going to be creating a Redux slice. So now we can come over to this part of our application again, and then we'll come over to our front end. So in our front end, we're going to come into SRC, into app, our features, our sessions, right click. Oh, we already have our session slice. Perfect. So we're going to create a session slice in here. And this is going to look, I mean, it's going to look like something. So first things first, we can get rid of this export, or we can get rid of this function. We don't need to import React. Instead, what we need to import is from the counter. We can come into the counter slice. We need to import this stuff here from the Redux toolkit. And actually what we'll do is we'll just Control A this, and we'll paste it into our session slice. And then we'll just come through here. We don't need to import fetch count. That's coming from an API that they set up. We don't need either of these states here, or either of these interfaces. We're going to leave this async thunk just because it's useful. We have a counter slice here. Instead, I want to change this to a session slice. Creates a initial state. I'm going to change this to session. We have our reducers in here, which we don't need to have like this. So we'll just leave it as an empty object for now. We have our extra reducers, which are going to take in 3 different cases. But it's not going to be this type of format because we do also need a .add case for the rejected case. And then we'll just leave it like this. So each of our calls to the API is basically going to have 3 different cases. One is where it's pending, which means it's loading. One is where it's fulfilled, which means successful. And one where it's rejected, which means it failed. So that's it for our extra reducers. We'll go ahead and we'll minimize that. We then have our export of consts here. We don't need to export any of these for now, but we will change this to session slice.actions. And for now, we'll leave this commented out. Now you do have the option to do some custom selectors here. We don't need these, so I'm going to comment that out. This is for custom thunks by hand. We don't need that, so I'm going to comment it out. Actually, I'm going to just straight up remove this because I don't really see that being needed at all. You can always grab it from the counter slice. And then down here where we export the session slice reducer, slice.reducer. Now we need to create an initial state, and this is a little bit tricky, but after a lot of playing around, I have a basic idea of what the React app or of what the Rails app is going to provide us. So we're going to do a const initial state, which is going to be of type auth state. And in here, we're going to have a current user. This current user is going to get back all of the stuff from our backend, app, controllers, API, users controller. So it's going to get an ID, an email, a role, and a created at. So we can come back over to here. It's going to get an ID, email, a role, and a created at. And instead of leaving these as strings, we're going to leave these as undefined just because it looks a little bit better that way to me. Now we need to give ourselves a loading, which we're going to set to true by default. We'll give ourselves a error, which is going to be set to false, a error messages, which is going to be an array, a access token, which is going to be undefined, a refresh token, which is going to go to a function that we call get refresh token, and expires in, which is going to be set to undefined, and it's going to have a token type, which is set to undefined. And I don't actually think the token type's used for anything. I just stored it because it was something that was given to me by Doorkeeper. But okay, we have all of that. We now need to create an auth state. And for that, I'm going to just copy the auth state interface. So the initial state is of type auth state, which is of type user for the users. And then the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. Loading's a Boolean, error's a Boolean, error messages are a string array, just like we had it in the sign up components. Access token is a string, refresh token is a string or null, expires in is a number, and token type is a string. And you'll see here that some of these are optional, just really depends on what state the app is in. Again, a lot of this was just trial and error to see how the logic works out, but I'll try and cover it as we get to those. Now we do have this user interface, which is going to be just completely optional for all of these because there is going to be a period where the user's info hasn't been like initialized yet. And then we have a user login data, which is just going to be the thing we use when we pass in like a login request with our login form. So that's just how we, in our login form here, how we give this payload a type. And it's similar in the sign up. It's going to be the same type of payload. So that gives us all of our interfaces there. We now need to create several async thunks, and we need to get this refresh token. So let's scroll down to the bottom and let's create those helper functions first. Basically, our get refresh token is going to be a function that returns something from local storage, which is the refresh token. And again, this is really only safe because we use those revolving refresh tokens that have an expiration time. That's why we have that expires in, and because we're so frequently refreshing them. You don't want to do this if it's just a static refresh token because then anyone can really access it and cause chaos. Now, because we're getting a refresh token, we also need to be able to store a refresh token, which you can do by creating a function called store refresh token, which takes in a string and just calls set item on local storage, sets the refresh token with whatever was passed in. And then the last thing we should do is just create a remove refresh token. This is just going to remove it out of local storage. It just a couple helper methods so that we don't have to type this entire line every time. We can just call this like small function and be done with it. So now we're going to scroll up and we have this async thunk here. We're going to need several of these. We're going to need I guess we'll do this first one, which we'll do for the sign up user. So instead of being increment async, we're going to say this is SignupUser, create async thunk. It's going to go to session/SignupUser. It's going to take an amount. It's still going to be async. That's why we're calling it an async thunk. But it's going to take in a payload of user login data, which we just declared up there. So this is the thing that has the username and password in it, or the email and password. And then it's going to take another one, which is reject with value. And we'll cover that in a second. Just make sure it's inside of a brace as a second argument to these parameters here. We then come in here and our response is equal to await. We're going to call this function, not fetch count, but we're going to call it create user with email and password, which is going to take in a payload.email and a payload.password. And it's going to look like this. We're going to bump up the font. Oh, we're going to bump up the font size one step here because a lot of this is more vertical than it is horizontal. So we should be good. So we need to create this actual function, but we first need to come down here and check if this response has any errors with an S. If it does, we then return reject with value response.errors. And because of how we set this up, we can then just return the response down here, which goes to the fulfilled action payload. This value right here goes to the rejected action payload, which is going to correspond to this sign up session, which is going to be down in our extra reducers. So instead of this being incremental async, it's going to be sign up user, sign up user, sign up user. The sign up user case is going to change from state.status to state.loading. This is pending. So while we're doing the sign up, pending is true, which means loading is true. And while you're loading, you don't have any errors and you don't have any error messages. So we set those appropriately. We then, in the case, will set the loading to be false, the error to be true, and the error messages to be action.payload.errors. And that means that this needs to take in an action, and we'll set this of type any. And this one will also be of type any because it's going to be taking in a whole bunch of stuff. But for now, this is fine. We need to create this create user with email and password. This is going to come from our front end API, which is going to be inside of app. We're going to create a new folder, call it API. And inside of API, we're going to create two files. One's going to be called Axios.ts. The other one is going to be called session.api.ts. Let's come into the Axios one first. We're going to start by importing Axios. We'll then create an instance of Axios, which we'll just call const instance, and then we'll export the instance. Now this might be a fragment from when I did this earlier. I had a different approach, but I don't know if we're actually using with credentials. The important part here is we need to import Axios and we need to set this backend URL. So let's exit out of here. We'll come over to our application. We'll cd into front end. We want to do a npm I Axios to install it. Exit out of that. We'll run a npm run start again. That fixes our error in here. We then need to come into our session API, which is going to import Axios. And then for our actual Axios process.env, we actually can just stop the server again. We want to do npm I.env. This is going to create this is going to allow us to use some environment variables. So for this, we're going to come into, before we do anything else, we're going to come into the git ignore and we're going to add .env to the git ignore. Now this is the git ignore for the front end specifically inside of the front end application. And because of that, we can put the .env file inside of the front end. So we'll say .env. And in here, this is just going to be a regular text file where we create some stuff. We're going to start with the React app backend URL. It's going to be set to localhost port 3000 /API/v1. That's where all our requests are going to go to. So we just leave it in here as a hard-coded constant. We then need a React client ID and a React client secret that we're going to set. And we need to get these. The way that we get these is we come over to our Rails app, which is conveniently printing them out for us. If you ever need to get these programmatically, you can come into the Rails application. I think it's the pages controller. You can see here at application equals Doorkeeper application.find by name, which we're creating in the seed file, remember? And then we call at application, which is equal to the name, which is the at application.name. The ID is the .uid and the secret is the .secret. That's what's getting printed out here on the homepage. That allows us to just very quickly copy this while we're developing, and we can paste that in as our client ID. We then need to grab the client secret, and we do the same thing in here. So now in our Axios file, when we call React Backend URL, you know that's coming from this .env file. It just allows us to not store it in our code base, and because it's in our git ignore, when we do a git status, our .env file doesn't appear here, which means it doesn't go up to the GitHub repo, which means it's safe. Okay, now it's time to deal with the next monster, which is the session API. We're going to start by creating a couple constants. We're going to have a login URL, which is going to go to /auth/token, which you'll hopefully remember is in the Doorkeeper API. /auth/token is to log in. We then have one to sign up, which matches the user's path right here to register. We then have one to log out, which is the revoke path. And it doesn't say it here because I didn't update the documentation yet, but we're also going to have one to get the current user, which is from /users/me. And that's coming from the config routes API.rb. And in here inside of namespace v1, we have get /users/me to the users controller me action, which is that users controller we were looking at earlier. So that's going to be the one that we get our user info from. After that, we need to set the client ID and the client secret, which we just grabbed from our .env file with process.env and then the appropriate names. Finally, from our session slice, we had this create user with email and password. So we're going to declare it in here. So it's going to be export async function, and then we'll paste this in. It's going to take in a email of type string and a password of type string. And then it's going to attempt to guess at what I want. We're going to start by creating some data. It's going to be equal to an object of email, set to email, password set to password, and client ID set to client ID, because in here the register said that we need an email, a password, and a client ID. So we're just matching up what these Swagger docs tell us we need. We then come down here and we say return Axios.post. It's going to go to the signup URL that we declared and take in the data. We then do .then with a response where we return the response.data. We then call .catch if there's any errors. We don't need to console log the errors, but we'll return the error.response.data. We can set this to be of type any in here. And the response can also be of type any, just like that. And that's it for this method. We then close this off at the semicolons where needed, and we have our first function. Now, the next couple are actually going to look pretty similar, but for now, I just want to test and see if this works. So we'll come back to our session slice, do dot on the session slice to import it, and then come down here, see what this error is. So when we sign up, because we're doing the sign up here, this is going to come back with some data. It's going to come back with the typical response that is an ID, access token, expires in, refresh, created at. This created at, though, I didn't like. It's just when the token was created at. Don't care. Instead, I modified it a bit. And if we come into controllers and the users controller, we have a registrations controller. This is where we're calling the create function when we do that token create, where does the client app Doorkeeper application find by client ID. and then says the allowed parameters are everything except for client ID, which means it's only the password and email, and then creates a new user. If the user could be saved, it calls render user, which comes from this Doorkeeper registratable concern, which is in this concerns folder, which if we open has a render user call, which does the access token again. But in here, this is everything we're going to get passed back. It's going to be an ID, an email, a role, an access token, a token type, an expires in, a refresh token, and a created at. So we need to set all of that inside of our session slice. So we're going to come down to our cases, and inside of our add case, I'm going to copy this because this is just a lot to type out. For each of these, we say state.whatever, so access, refresh, expires in, token type, and then we call action.payload and then the equivalent. But we're converting it from the snake case over here with the underscores to a camel case over here because it's JavaScript land. Then we have all that user info, which we want to set on the current user. And because we're not returning a user object, we're just returning individual attributes, which is a little bit messy. This should probably be inside of a user. We do it this way, where we just say state.currentUser equals an object, and then it's ID equal to ID email role, and then the user created at, as opposed to when the token was created. So we can save all of that. And then at the bottom here, after we do the state.currentUser, we want to say store the refresh token, which we've just set right here. And that is the function we created down here to set it inside of our local storage. After we do that, we then say we're not loading, there are no errors, and there are no error messages. So we can save all of that and come over to our sign up page where we commented this response. We can get rid of that. Instead of doing a hard-coded response, we can leave it like that. And we can save this. Now this still says login user because I don't really pay attention to stuff. So instead we want to come into the session slice and we want to call sign up user. Come over to here, sign up user, and then we'll do control dot, add import. There we go. Now we can come over to our React app. We'll run a npm run start, and then we'll refresh the application. So we're going to come over to create account. We'll open up the console just to see if anything goes boom. We'll start with test at case.com. Actually, you know what? Let's just start with test password and see what happens. And we have the form validations to tell us this isn't a right email address. So we'll say test at case.com, which I think is a user account we already created. I'm going to zoom out 1 or 2 steps so we can at least get all of this in the frame. I'll click create account. It tells us passwords don't match. So I'll say pass. I'll click create account. Oh, and it redirects us to the login page. Okay, so that's because we need to come over to the persist login and we need to change the persist login logic. Because remember, our persist login and our routes were just hard coded with how they were set up. So we'll start in persist login. Basically, we need to use a whole bunch of selectors to grab stuff from the store. So instead of doing it like this, we're going to say use selector, which is going to grab something from the state, which is going to be state.session.loading, which is what we're setting in the session slice. Because in here we set the loading to be true whenever we're loading something. We need to import use selector, and we need to import the root state. We also need to add this session to our store. So we need to come over to our app, our store.ts. We need to say session is the session reducer, like that, which we need to import. And that's going to come from import session reducer from the /features/sessions/session slice. Now we can come over to the persist login and this will be fine. We now need to also do this dispatch to refresh the user token at some point, but for now we'll leave it like this. We can replace the access token with another selector to the access token, and we can do the same thing for the refresh token, and we can just grab all of those from the store now. We're not going to do the refresh yet. That's fine. The rest of this we're going to leave, and we're going to save it. Now our loading is going to be set to true by default. So because of this, we want to call the dispatch for the refresh token, because I guess that'll set the loading to be appropriate. So we need to import the dispatch. So we need to say const dispatch equals use dispatch, which means we have to import it from React Redux. And then we have to create this refresh access token method in our session slice. Now the refresh access token is going to look a little bit different than our sign up method right here. We're going to paste it. We're going to call this refresh access token. We'll make sure this string here matches. This is going to take in a refresh token instead of a payload, and that can be a string, undefined, or null. The first thing we want to do is we want to do a check to see if the refresh token is undefined or null by just doing an exclamation mark refresh token, in which case we do a reject with value and we say no refresh token. That of course will send us to the rejected action payload. If we do have a refresh token, we then need to call a function, which we're going to call request access token with refresh token, which is a mouthful, but that's going to be in our session API again. And it's going to look pretty similar to this create user with email. So we're going to say export async function request access token, blah, 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 blah. Nobody cares. This is going to take in a refresh token of type string. It's going to have a grant of refresh token, a refresh token, a refresh token, and then it takes in a client ID and a client secret. It then returns an Axios.post for the login URL that, again, we defined up here to be OAuth/token, which, of course, came from our Swagger that said OAuth/token is the login. We then do a .then to grab the response.data and the response or the error.response.data. And when you go to login, you're actually going to be going to the Doorkeeper controllers. So inside of the controllers folder, there's going to be a Doorkeeper folder. And I haven't modified these, but I grabbed these just to look at them. This is what happens under the hood with the Doorkeeper gem. So when you call that function, it's going to come in here to create, where it does headers.merge, authorized response headers, does a whole bunch of logic. Then it calls render JSON authorized.body and authorized.status. So that logic's going to happen, and it's going to come back to here. And if there's an error, I just click something. If there's an error, you'll get it through that response, or you'll get the data through that response. We can then save this, go back to our session slice where we call that function. We can import it. We then check if this specific refresh response has a error instead of .errors. It's a little bit weird. I'm not a fan, but if it does, we can then do response.data or refresh response.data. After we do that, we then do something similar where we do a call to get the current user, which is a function we have to create in our API. So we come back to our API and we do a export async function to get the current user, which takes in an access token instead, which is of type string. And for this, what we want to do is a const config equals to something that has headers, which takes in an authorization, which is going to have a string with the word bearer and then a space and then your access token. And that's just the format for authorization tokens. This is just the thing that you pass around in a header like this that lets you access pages, basically. So if you need to be logged in, you pass in your access token as a header, as an authorization header, and then it says, okay, cool, you're in. I guess I don't really care. You can then do return Axios, call .get for the current user URL, which we set up here to be /user/me. and then you pass in the config. You then do a dot then, return this response.data. You then do a dot catch, response or error.response.data, and then we can fix the formatting here like that. There we go. So now we can come back to the session slice. We can import this. We then do a check to see for the user response. So user response, if it has an error, then do the user response.data as the reject with value. And then as you get to the end here, we need to combine the refresh response and the user response. So we do a const response equals an object where we just throw the two together like that. And then we return the response. Now we need to grab this refresh access token and give it some cases. So what I like to do for this is I just copy 3 cases that cover rejected, fulfilled, and pending, and I paste them right here. I then change this to refresh access token, which is our function name up here. I paste it in that one, I paste it in this one, and I paste it in this one. So for our case where we're loading, it's true, false, and the empty array again. For the case where it's fulfilled, you're setting everything except for the token type, but it's going to be the access token, the refresh token, and the expires in all get updated. You then get your user information from the user response that we constructed. You then store the refresh token and you set these to loading is false, error is false, and messages is the empty array. And if it's rejected, you don't actually have any error messages in this case. Your loading is false, but your error is true. And then we can save that. And now we can come over to the persist login. Again, it's really hard to keep track of why you're doing all of these things, but all the way back here, we need to now import this function. We can get rid of these, or get rid of this log. And instead of doing the error refreshing, we can just pass in the error. And now we can save this. So we can come back over to our React app, wherever that may be, and try to create an account. We'll refresh. We can see that we're calling post requests right now. Let me check our cookies. I'm going to remove all of our cookies and refresh the page. Now in here, we're going to do test@case.com with a password of password, just like that. You can see there a little will never share your email. I'll click create account, which sends me to the login page because we fixed the persist login. But if we come into the private route, we haven't fixed the private route yet. This is just sort of how I like to cover this because to me, it makes a little bit more sense to cover it this way. But thankfully, what we can do is we can copy the loading, access, and refresh token into the private route. You can replace the loading and access just like that. We don't need the refresh token in here, but we do need to import the selector and the root state from our store. And the rest of this logic can stay the same. We can now come to our dashboard and it allows us to sit on our dashboard without redirecting us. It'd be nice if we had some info on the dashboard though. So let's go ahead and let's open up our dashboard, which is just the word dashboard right now. And I should note you do actually have to manually navigate to the dashboard still. But in here, we can actually grab the current user from a use selector to the state.session.currentUser, the access token, and the refresh token. We then need to import all of these, and then we can create a section inside of our return, say section. We'll do an H1 for dashboard. We'll then create a UL, and then we'll say, what did I do here? We'll do one more UL. This will have an li times 3, times 4, I lied. I'll hit tab. And that's just coming from the emit tab completion. And this is going to be an ID, which is going to be current user .ID. And then we'll just copy this actually, and we'll paste it a couple times because I don't feel like doing this multiple times. It's going to be ID, email, role, and the created @ which is going to be capital A @ Afterwards, we can then save this, or I guess we can then tab this over. And then for this first UL here, we're going to say this is the li, which is going to be the current user. And then we'll close the li right here. And then we'll tab this all over. And then down here below the current user li, we'll create 2 more, one for the access token and one for the refresh token. Then refresh the page, and now you can see our data appearing here. If we refresh, you'll see that our tokens change as we hit the database multiple times to make sure our refresh tokens are refreshed. Now, just as a note, to get rid of those errors there, sometimes you do just have to close the file and open it again, and it gets rid of our errors. Okay, so now we have that working. Let's, I guess, move on. Naturally, I would love to test the login functionality, but we currently don't have any way to log out. So what I'd like to do is over here in this little icon is add in a logout button like this one, but one that actually works. So we need to come into our AppBar. So we'll say features, AppBar, AppBar.tsx. We'll scroll up to the top and it comes with a whole bunch of stuff, but we need to add our own stuff. We need to add a call to use navigate. And then we need to grab the same things we just grabbed in the dashboard. We're going to grab the access token, loading, and current user. I guess we're grabbing loading instead of refresh token. So we'll save this so that we can get more errors, and then we can start importing these things. Add an import to React Router DOM, add an import for React Redux, add an import from the store for the root state. We'll come down below all of their functions and we'll add our own section. We're going to create one, which is going to look kind of ugly, but in here we're going to need a function for handle navigate, which is going to take in a route and an event, which is going to take in a route and an event. We'll give those types in a second because it's kind of ugly. We then want to call event.preventDefault with a question mark there just to do some optional chaining. Then we want to navigate to the route. The other one we want to do is for the handle logout button, which is going to be a function handle logout, which takes in a event. And this is just going to be event prevent default. I actually don't know if these can be optional or not, but it's going to call handle close user menu, which is what they have up here, which is just the thing that causes the little button up here to close the little help menu. This is going to have a whole bunch of errors. And then after we do that, we can then navigate to logout. Now I want the icon in the top right to be the login logout dropdown if you're logged in. Otherwise, I want it to be a create account or a login account. So that's why we're grabbing the access token. So we're going to say if we have an access token, that means we're logged in. Else, we don't have an access token. So we want to render something else. If we're logged in, we want session links to be equal to the drop-down menu. So we got to come down here to the drop-down menu. So we're going to grab this box right here, all the way up to this box, cut it. And we're just going to replace it with that session links variable. And we'll scroll back up. And after session links, we'll say equals that entire box. And then we'll put a semicolon at the end of it and pretend that this is a totally normal thing to do. Again, I would extract this out to a separate component, but for now, this is fine. Now we can scroll past all of this. The settings here, we're going to get rid of the map. And instead, we'll just give this a logout text. And instead of it being handle logout, we will pass in an event to handle logout, which takes in an event. Now this has a key. We don't need the key. We can then save this, come back over to here. This actually does need to be an else if. I'm not making a lot of sense. Else if we don't have an access token and we're not loading. So we're not logged in. We've confirmed that 100%. We then want to grab two buttons, which are down here somewhere. These buttons. Grab these buttons, scroll back up. We want the session links to be equal to an HTML fragment, which will contain two of these fine buttons here that look something like that. We don't need them to have a key. They can keep their styling. That's fine. This can come back over to here. The text for this one is going to be create account. Remember, we're not logged in, so that's why we're doing it. And then our button right here is fine. We will collapse this one. This doesn't need a key. It can have a login text, and then we're good to go with that. Now, the one thing I do want to do here is the on click we can change. This no longer has a closed nav menu, I think. It might actually, now that I'm thinking about it. I guess that depends on what the dropdown looks like. But for now, we will paste this in. So we're going to pass in an event to handle navigate, the other function we made, which takes in /signup and the event. And we'll do the same thing here, but instead of it being sign up, this will be login. Real quick, while I was editing, I just wanted to add in that you can add that little top bar menu that has your name in it. Let me pop over to the application. So when you log in as test@case.com and a password of password, you can add that little name up here by replacing this tooltip with this box. So it's just a regular box with a typography right here that just has the current user with an optional chaining for the email, and then the regular tooltip. And by doing that, if we come over here and refresh, you'll see the username, or I guess the email is displayed here. And if you hover over the button, you still get the tooltip, but you don't get it over here. And it all works just fine. Okay, that's it. Back to the original recording. So that's how we're doing it. We then come up to our handle navigate here. It says quick fix, and we say infer types based on what we're doing. And then our event here needs a quick fix, infer types, which makes sense to me. Now we're good with that. So let's exit out of this and refresh the page. So we have our little icon here. We have the logout text. Let's click the logout button. It takes us to the logout page. That works. We just have to actually do the logout logic now, right? Okay, so we'll come into our logout page. This is going to need two consts. One's going to be for navigate and one's going to be for dispatch. The other thing we need here is the refresh token. So we'll do the import for navigate. We'll do the import for dispatch. We'll do the import for selector, and we'll do the import for root state. We then need to create a use effect, and then we will close this, comma. It only needs to fire once. We're going to check if we have a refresh token. If we do, we'll say dispatch logout user, and then we can do navigate to /login. And we never actually render this return here, but we can leave it just because. So now we need to do this logout user inside of our session slice. So we'll come over to our session slice again. This means we need another function here. So the logout user is actually a lot easier than the refresh access. So we'll do it right below sign up. So I'm just going to paste it in here. We're going to say export const logout user. We, of course, change the name here to session/logout user. I would just copy one of these others and then change the text. We then say it's an async with a payload, which is a string. That's, of course, our token that we're passing in. We give it a const response equal to, and then we call a function called logout with token. After we do that, we then check if there's any errors, and that's .error here, singular. If there is, we reject with value response, which we, of course, know is because that takes us to the rejected action payload. Down here for the response, that is our fulfilled action. We then have a logout user with token that we need to create in our API. So we come over to our session API, and then we can do this, I guess, right above the refresh access. So we'll do it below the create user. Export async logout user with token, which takes in a token of type string. And then we'll hope that GitHub Copilot knows what I want. So it says const data, token is token, client ID is client ID, client secret is client secret. Beautiful. It already knows my code base. We should probably say this is a function, huh? And we'll come over here, return Axios dot post to the logout URL, which is up here, our revoke dot then response dot data catch error dot response dot data, and we can close this. Now we can come back over to our session slice. We can import this. Now we can go down to we can then copy these three, I guess. It's the pending, the fulfilled, and the rejected. We'll paste them in here. We'll leave the semicolon at the end. And then instead of this being for the refresh access token, this is going to be for the logout user. Oops, I guess it didn't paste it properly. We'll do that. It'll be for logout user.pending, logout user.fulfilled, and logout user.rejected. For pending, it is true, false, and the empty array again. For fulfilled, it's going to be, I'm just going to copy this. The state.currentUser is going to be set to ID undefined, email undefined, role undefined, created at undefined, access, refresh, expires, and then token type all undefined. And then we're not going to store it. We'll instead call our little remove refresh token function, which we defined at the bottom here. So that's this one, which just removes the refresh token from local storage. We then have false for loading, false for error, and the empty array for messages. If we get an error while logging out, we set the state.error messages to be the action.payload.error, and then we can save that. So now we should be good in our logout to import that. So we'll import that from session slice, which takes us back to the login page. Now I'd like to create a link up here to go to the dashboard just to see if it works. So let's change the AppBar real quick. And actually, while we're here, I'm going to stop the server and do a git branch just to see what I called this branch. So this is for the session slice. So I'm going to do another cd ... git status, git add git commit -m, add session slice for sign up and log out. And then we can exit out of that and do an npm run start again, and then do an npm run start. So let's full screen this, and let's come over to the AppBar. We'll scroll down here. We have this little logo text, which is this right here. I'm going to change this to say WishList, which is just what I'm going to be calling the app. Now you'll see that didn't actually change because we have to refresh the page. Then come down here to this logo right here, change this one to WishList. And then we have our pages. We're going to get rid of the map for the pages. We'll get rid of this, and we'll just say this is for the dashboard. This doesn't need to have a key on it. And our event or our on click will be event handle navigate to /. And let's actually change this to home instead of dashboard. Feeling adventurous today. And then let's tab this over to match everything else a little bit. So let's come up here, refresh. Now I'm going to click the home button, and it takes us back to the login page. I'm going to click create account, takes us to the sign up page, and login takes us to the login page. So all of that seems to be working. I'm now going to try to log in to test.case.com. And that's not going to work. And it logs out here that something went wrong. And we can, of course, do a Control F for something went wrong and come into the login page. And our response in the login component is not calling the dispatch. You know what that means? We have to uncomment the dispatch, get rid of this response, and now we have to go implement this. So we're going to go back to the session slice. We're going to scroll up, and we're going to grab the refresh access token. And we're going to go, I guess, above the logout user, and we're going to paste in a login user. So we're going to say login user. Login user. It's going to take in a payload, which is going to be of type user login data. It doesn't need to check if it's null because we have that check in the front end logic. We can then pass in a payload.email and a payload.password. This function will then be called login with email and password. We'll change this from a refresh response to a login response, which which means this changes and this changes. And we're going to just return the login response in the event of an error. We can then see we have the user response, which is still going to be refresh response, but instead we're going to grab the login response.access token. If there's a user response.error, we just return user response.data. And then down here for the response, we change this to a login response. We now need to go create this login with email and password. So we'll come up to session API, and right above the logout, we'll say export async function login with email and password, which will take in a email and password, and GitHub Copilot really auto-completed there. Okay, so email of type string, password of type string, that's correct. Const data, it's going to be grant type of password. Client ID is going to be client ID. So remember, with our other login method, we pass in a grant type of refresh token to the login URL. Here we're passing in the grant type of password because we're going to be using a username and password. The rest of this actually looks very similar to our refresh access token down here. It just goes with the client ID, client secret, username, and email. And I'm going to move these down. As much as I appreciate what GitHub Copilot did, it makes more sense to me to keep it like this. So grant type password, username, email. This actually needs to be email. It was close. You have to give GitHub Copilot credit. It was close. But yeah, email, password, password. So we can save that. We can come back to our session slice. We can import that function. We can grab the cases down here, grab the logout user. Actually, let's grab the SignupUser. That probably makes more sense. So we're going to grab SignupUser, SignupUser, and then we'll paste it in here. And for the sign up, the initial one here, we're going to say this is for login user, login user.fulfilled, and login user.rejected. For the pending, it is true, false, and the empty array. The access token is the same. Refresh token is the same. Expires in is the same. We don't get a token type from this one. The current user, all of these are still the same with how they're returned. We then store the refresh token. We set loading and error to false and the error messages to be the empty array. We come to the rejected. It's going to be false, true, and instead of doing this action.payloads, I don't like the error the Doorkeeper gives. So instead, we'll just set a custom error message where we say invalid credentials. Did you enter them correctly? ? And we'll save that. We can then come into the login component and import it. And we can save this file and we can refresh the page. And now let's do test@case.com with a password of 1234. And our errors aren't being set, but we'll deal with that in a second. Let's do a test@case.com with a password of password, which allows us to log in. And now you can see our little icon changed again. I can go to dashboard. Let me try to go to /login. That still allows us to go to the login page. So that's something we have to look at. Let's go back to the dashboard though. This seems fine. And then let's click logout, which takes us to the login page. And then we can't log in again. If we try to create an account, we'll say test@case.com with a password of password. That also isn't rendering our errors. And that's because we're not dispatching this error state here. So we're going to come into our use effect and we need to change a couple things actually. The first one is our error messages needs to be a const error messages equal to use selector where we grab error messages from the store. We can then leave these set errors to be the same. We don't need to set the error messages to be the empty array though. We actually want to dispatch an action called reset error state. So if we come into our session slice again and we scroll up to the reducers here, we're actually going to create a custom reducer. We're going to say reset error state, which takes in the state. And it's going to set the error to be false and error messages to be the empty array. We then need to grab this. This behaves a little differently than the async ones. And down here where we have the session slice actions, we'll put in our reset error state as the export. So we can save that, and then we can come back to our login component, and we can import our use selector, our root state. We can import our reset error state. It looks like it's unhappy that this might be null, so let's go to our session slice and search for this. Our error messages should no longer be optional. We can come back to our login component, and that'll clear up our errors. We can actually grab this exact thing to our signup component, scroll up to the top, paste it in, and then come back to our login component, grab the error messages, and we can paste them in right here. We then need to import the reset error state. We need to import the use selector, and we need to import the root state. We can then exit out of this and refresh the page. Say test at case.com with a password of password1, just like that. Click login, and it'll tell us invalid credentials. Did you enter them correctly? Say test at case2.com with a password of password. That's not going to work. We'll say test at case.com with a password of password. That'll let us log in. We can then come over here and log out. Come over to create an account. We'll say test at case.com. We'll pass in the number 1 and the number 1. So it's just very short. Click create. Okay, so I just went through a pretty big session of bug fixing because I missed something pretty not great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and cover what I changed. Basically, I come into the signup component and I just check if the error messages do not equal undefined, which the only time they will is if we're before we've managed to like set up the Redux store. This should always be defined, in which case we're just setting errors to the empty array, and then we're dispatching to reset errors to the empty array. So if there's ever any errors in here, it'll get reset down here, and they'll get stored in the errors array. I can get rid of that too. That's another fragment of my debugging. Now down here in the handle submit, I call the dispatch SignupUser payload. I check if errors equal undefined, or actually what I could do is check if error messages .length is greater than 0. And then if that's the case, we navigate to /, otherwise we set the error messages. We can come down here and the rest of this I think stayed the same. So now let me come over to create account, and I'm going to try to create test at case.com with a password of 1 and 1. And you'll see here, email has already been taken and the password is too short. However, if you try and do that, it'll fail because I realized that in here, up until a couple seconds ago, I still had the access token and the loading set equal to false. So what we need to do, I'm going to come back here, is we need to set the access and loading to be equal to the use selectors for the access token and the loading. At that point, your public route should look like this. And I would compare it because I'm not sure, I might have missed something when I'm editing this in my changes. And your private route should look like this. So your public sends you to / if you don't have a from location, and your private sends you to /login. Both need to have loading and access token in them. This one doesn't need navigate anymore, so I can get rid of that. I can come into here. This looks fine. We come into sign up. This all looks fine to me, and I don't think I really changed anything in session except for error messages it's no longer a question mark. It's forced to be an array. If I come into the sign up component, let me come up here. I also changed the errors in here to be an array of strings. So I'm going to also change that in login just to keep it consistent. And just like in login, we're checking if this is not defined, but what else we can do is we can just check if the length is greater than 0. We can then scroll down here. We can check if the dot length is greater than 0, because this should never be undefined. The more I'm looking at it, the more I hate myself for having done that. But you got to remember, it's like late at night for me right now. But okay, let me now try to refresh this page. I'm going to do a test at case.com with a password of password. Email is taken. Test at case.com. No fields. Pass and word. So you can see they're different. Passwords do not match. Let me say pass and pass. Too short. Let me try test at example.com with a password of password. This should succeed. It takes us to the dashboard. Now let me refresh. That still works. Let me come back to the settings and click log out. That seems fine. Let me now try to log in. Let me now try to log in with test at case.com and a password of 123456778. That doesn't work. Test at case.com and a password of password. That does work. Okay. Now, assuming I managed to capture all of the changes that I made there, you should have a working login, logout system here that also allows you to log into the backend of the Rails app. So let me log into Dean at example.com. And I'll go to the webhooks. That works. Now let me come over to the Redux app and log into that admin account, Dean at example.com. We definitely have persistence there. The code could, of course, be cleaned up a bit. That will be covered in part 2, which I'm hoping will cover grabbing these books and displaying them to the user when the user's logged in, or more likely, I'm planning on converting this into a WishList app. I just don't know what that's going to look like. That's going to do it for this tutorial, though. Again, if you need to get caught up on the Doorkeeper portion of this tutorial, I did a video on that last week, and I'll have a link to that video on the screen right now.